My name is Hadley, and I'm 22 years old. Growing up in suburban Cleveland, Ohio, I learned early that love in my family came with conditions, and apparently I never met them. My brother Ethan was born 3 years before me, and from the moment I could understand words, I knew he was special. Not in the way every parent thinks their child is special, but genuinely exceptional in my parents' eyes. When Ethan showed interest in baseball at age 6, Dad immediately signed him up for the most expensive league in town. When he mentioned wanting to learn piano, Mom drove 40 minutes each way twice a week to take him to the best instructor in the area. I remember being 9 years old, sitting at our worn kitchen table doing homework while Mom counted bills. The stack seemed thinner than usual, and I could see the worry lines deepening around her eyes. That same week, Ethan announced he wanted to try lacrosse because his friend Jake said it was cool. Without hesitation, Dad bought him a complete set of equipment that cost more than our monthly grocery budget. When I asked if I could join the school art club, which only required a $20 supply fee, Mom looked at me like I'd asked for the moon. "Hadley, honey, we need to be practical about money right now," she said, her voice carrying that apologetic tone that somehow never extended to Ethan's requests. The house we lived in was a modest 2-bedroom ranch that Dad had inherited from his parents. It wasn't much, but it was ours, and I loved the way the afternoon sunlight streamed through the living room windows, creating patterns on the hardwood floors that Dad had refinished himself. Mom had painted the walls a warm yellow that made everything feel cozy, even when tensions ran high. Ethan got the larger bedroom naturally. Mine was barely bigger than a closet, but I made it work. I hung my drawings on every available inch of wall space and arranged my few books on a shelf Dad had installed when I turned 10. It was my sanctuary, the one place where I felt like I mattered. High school brought new challenges and deeper divides. Ethan made varsity football as a sophomore, and suddenly our house became a shrine to his achievements. Trophies lined the mantelpiece, newspaper clippings covered the refrigerator, and every conversation somehow circled back to his latest game or scholarship prospects. I threw myself into academics, maintaining a 4.0 GPA while working part-time at Henderson's hardware store downtown. Mr. Henderson was a kind man in his 70s who treated me like the granddaughter he never had. He taught me about business, responsibility, and most importantly, that hard work had value regardless of whether anyone noticed. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, Hadley," he'd say while I restocked shelves or helped customers find the right screws for their projects. "Don't let anyone tell you different." Those words meant more to me than any praise I'd received at home, which wasn't saying much. When I brought home report cards filled with A's, Mom would glance at them and say, "That's nice, sweetie," before turning her attention back to Ethan's B in chemistry that required immediate tutoring intervention. The financial strain became more apparent as we got older. Dad worked double shifts at the automotive plant, coming home exhausted and covered in grease, only to spend his evenings driving Ethan to practice or games. Mom took on additional cleaning jobs, her hands becoming rough and red from constant exposure to harsh chemicals. Yet somehow, there was always money for Ethan. When he needed new cleats, they appeared. When his team traveled to tournaments, the registration fees were paid without question. When he wanted to attend an expensive football camp during the summer, my parents took out a small loan to make it happen. I learned not to ask for things. When my only pair of jeans developed holes at the knees, I wore them until Mom finally noticed and bought me a replacement from the clearance rack at Walmart. When my ancient laptop finally gave up during my senior year, I did my homework on the library computers and saved every penny from my job to buy a used one. The breaking point came during my high school graduation. I was valedictorian, had been accepted to Ohio State University with a partial academic scholarship, and had worked my way up to assistant manager at Henderson's Hardware. It should have been a proud moment for my family. Instead, the conversation at our graduation dinner at Applebee's revolved around Ethan's upcoming freshman year at Notre Dame, where he'd received a full football scholarship. Mom and Dad beamed as they discussed his dorm arrangements, meal plans, and how proud they were of their college athlete. When the waitress congratulated me on my graduation and asked about my plans, I mentioned Ohio State and my academic achievements. My parents nodded politely, but quickly redirected the conversation back to Ethan's future in college football. That night, Lying in my tiny bedroom for what I knew might be one of the last times, I made a decision that would shape the next 4 years of my life. I was going to succeed, not just despite my family's indifference, but because of it. I was going to prove that the quiet, overlooked daughter had value too. College at Ohio State was a revelation. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who valued intelligence, creativity, and hard work. My partial scholarship covered tuition, but I needed to earn money for housing, food, and books. While other freshmen were joining sororities and going to parties, I was working 3 different part-time jobs. I cleaned offices in the early morning before classes, tutored struggling students in the evening, and worked weekends at a local bookstore. The schedule was exhausting, but every dollar I earned was mine, and the independence was intoxicating. My major in business administration with a focus on real estate development wasn't chosen randomly. During high school, I'd become fascinated with the housing market and property values while helping customers at Henderson's Hardware with their home improvement projects. I'd seen how small investments in fixing up a property could dramatically increase its value, and I began to understand that real estate was one of the most reliable paths to building wealth. Professor Martinez, who taught my introductory economics course, noticed my enthusiasm for real estate topics and became an informal mentor. She was a Latina woman in her 40s who had built her own property investment portfolio while working as an academic. Real estate is about more than buying and selling, Hadley, she explained during one of our office hour conversations. It's about understanding communities, recognizing potential, and sometimes it's about justice. I didn't fully understand what she meant by justice until later, but her words stuck with me. My relationship with my family during college was complicated. I called home every few weeks, and the conversations followed a predictable pattern. Mom would ask how my classes were going, I'd give a brief update, and then we'd spend the remaining time discussing Ethan's football career, social life, and various achievements at Notre Dame. He was thriving there, which I was genuinely happy about. Ethan had always been a good brother to me, even if he was oblivious to how differently our parents treated us. It wasn't his fault that he was the golden child any more than it was my fault that I wasn't. The phone calls also included updates about my parents' financial situation, which seemed to be getting worse. Dad had been laid off from the automotive plant during my sophomore year and was struggling to find steady work. Mom's cleaning jobs weren't enough to cover their expenses, especially with the house payments and the debt they'd accumulated supporting Ethan's various activities over the years. During winter break of my junior year, I came home to find my childhood house in obvious decline. The paint was peeling, several shingles were missing from the roof, and the front steps were starting to sag. Inside, the warm yellow walls had faded, and I noticed my parents had sold several pieces of furniture. "We're managing fine," Mom insisted when I asked about their situation, but I could see the stress lines around her eyes had deepened. Dad spent most of my visit applying for jobs online, his shoulders hunched in defeat. That's when I learned they were 3 months behind on their mortgage payments. "We don't want you to worry about this," Dad said when I overheard him on the phone with the bank. "It's not your problem to solve," but it felt like my problem. This house, despite everything, was still my childhood home. It was where I'd learned to read at the kitchen table, where I'd hung my drawings on my bedroom walls, where I'd dreamed of a future that seemed impossible from my tiny room. I returned to Columbus with a new sense of purpose. My grades had always been excellent, but now I attacked my studies with laser focus. I took extra courses, completed internships, and networked relentlessly. Professor Martinez introduced me to several local real estate developers, and I spent my free time learning about property markets, financing, and investment strategies. By my senior year, I had secured a position with Riverside Development, one of Columbus's most successful real estate firms. The starting salary was more than I'd ever imagined earning, and the company had a reputation for rapid advancement for employees who demonstrated exceptional performance. Marcus Webb, the senior partner who hired me, was a self-made man who had built his company from nothing. During my final interview, he looked at my resume and said, "You've got something most candidates don't have, Hadley. You understand what it means to work for everything you get. That's valuable." I graduated summa cum laude in May, with job offers from 3 different firms. I chose Riverside because of their focus on both commercial and residential development, which would give me the broadest experience in the shortest time. My parents attended my graduation, and I could see they were proud, even if they weren't quite sure what my degree meant in practical terms. Ethan had finished his junior year at Notre Dame and was being scouted by several NFL teams, which dominated most of our conversations that weekend. But for the first time, I didn't mind being overlooked. I had my own plans now, and they were bigger than anything my family could imagine. Starting at Riverside Development was like drinking from a fire hose. Marcus Webb believed in throwing new employees into challenging situations to see how they handled pressure, and I was assigned to projects that typically went to people with several years of experience. My first major assignment was analyzing a portfolio of distressed properties in various Ohio cities, including Cleveland. The company was considering purchasing these properties at auction, renovating them, and either selling or renting them for profit. It was exactly the kind of work I'd dreamed about during college. I spent weeks driving throughout Ohio, examining properties, researching neighborhood trends, and calculating potential returns on investment. The work was challenging but exhilarating, and I found myself staying late most evenings, poring over spreadsheets and market data. One of the properties on my list was in Lakewood, a suburb just west of Cleveland. As I drove through the neighborhood, I was struck by how similar it was to the area where I'd grown up. The houses were modest but well-maintained. The streets were lined with mature trees, and there was a sense of community that reminded me of home. The property itself was a foreclosure, similar in size and style to my parents' house. As I walked through the empty rooms, taking measurements and notes, I had an idea that was so audacious I almost dismissed it immediately. But the numbers were compelling. The house was priced well below market value due to its foreclosure status and the fact that it needed significant renovations. However, the neighborhood was experiencing gradual gentrification, and properties were appreciating steadily. With the right improvements, this house could be worth nearly double the purchase price within 2 years. More importantly, I realized that if I could make this work, I could help my parents while also making a smart investment. I spent the next 2 weeks refining my analysis, creating detailed renovation budgets, and researching financing options. The more I studied the opportunity, the more convinced I became that it was viable. The challenge was that I'd only been working for 3 months and hadn't yet received my first significant paycheck. However, Riverside offered employee investment opportunities, and Marcus had mentioned that exceptional employees could sometimes participate in company deals with reduced capital requirements. I requested a meeting with Marcus and presented my proposal with the same thoroughness I'd applied to company projects. I explained my analysis of the Lakewood property, my renovation plans, and my projection for returns. I also disclosed that this was personal for me, that I wanted to purchase the property not just as an investment, but as a way to help my family. Marcus listened without interruption, occasionally asking pointed questions about my assumptions and calculations. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and was quiet for several minutes. "You know, Hadley, most people your age are thinking about apartments and student loan payments," he said finally. "You're thinking like a developer. That's either very smart or completely crazy." He paused, studying my financial projections. "Probably both," he continued with a slight smile. "But I like crazy when it's backed up by solid analysis. Here's what I'm willing to do. Riverside will co-invest in this property with you. We'll provide 70% of the capital, you provide 30%, and we'll split the profits proportionally. More importantly, I'll connect you with our renovation contractors so you get fair pricing on the work." I felt like I might faint. 30% of the purchase price and renovation costs was still a substantial amount of money, but it was achievable with my signing bonus, savings, and a small personal loan. "There's one condition," Marcus added. "You manage this project in addition to your regular responsibilities. I want to see how you handle multiple priorities. If you succeed, there will be more opportunities like this in the future." I agreed immediately, probably a little too enthusiastically, but Marcus just laughed. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork, inspections, and financial arrangements. I drove to Cleveland every weekend to oversee the renovation work. learning about plumbing, electrical systems, and construction management from the contractors Marcus had recommended. My parents knew I was working on a real estate project, but didn't understand the details. They were dealing with their own crisis. The bank had initiated foreclosure proceedings on their house, and they had 60 days to either catch up on payments or face eviction. I wanted to tell them about my plan, but I was terrified that something would go wrong. What if the renovation went over budget? What if I'd miscalculated the market value? What if the bank wouldn't approve the financing I needed? Instead, I told them I was exploring options to help and asked them not to make any hasty decisions about the house. "Hadley, sweetheart, we appreciate that you want to help," Mom said during one of our phone calls. "But this isn't something you need to worry about. Your father and I will figure something out." But I could hear the defeat in her voice, and I knew they were running out of options. The renovation was progressing well, but every day felt like a race against time. I was working 12-hour days at Riverside, then driving to Cleveland on weekends to check on the construction progress. I was exhausted, but driven by a sense of purpose I'd never experienced before. 3 weeks before my parents' foreclosure deadline, I received the call I'd been waiting for. The renovation was complete, and the property had been appraised at exactly the value I'd projected. More importantly, I had a cash buyer ready to purchase it at full market price. The numbers were even better than I'd hoped. After splitting the profit with Riverside and paying back my personal loan, I would have enough money to pay off my parents' mortgage entirely and still have a substantial amount left over. But first, I had to figure out how to explain to my family that their overlooked daughter had just bought their house. The conversation I'd been planning for weeks finally happened on a cold November Saturday. I drove from Columbus to Cleveland, my stomach churning with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. In my briefcase were documents that would change my family's life, but I wasn't sure how they'd react to what I'd done. I found my parents in the kitchen, surrounded by paperwork and wearing expressions of resigned defeat. Dad was on the phone with yet another potential employer, while Mom sorted through bills with mechanical precision. "Hadley!" Mom's face brightened when she saw me, though the worry lines around her eyes remained prominent. "We weren't expecting you this weekend. I have something important to discuss with you both," I said, setting my briefcase on the kitchen table where I'd done homework so many years ago. Dad finished his phone call and joined us, looking older than his 52 years. The stress of unemployment and potential foreclosure had taken a visible toll on both my parents. "Mom, Dad, I know you've been trying to handle the mortgage situation on your own, but I want you to know what I've been working on." I opened my briefcase and pulled out a folder containing the documents I'd prepared. 3 months ago, I purchased and renovated a house in Lakewood as an investment project through my company. Yesterday, I sold that house. My parents looked confused, unsure why I was telling them about a real estate deal. "The profit from that sale was substantial," I continued, my voice steadying as I got to the heart of what I wanted to say. "Substantial enough to pay off your mortgage completely." I placed a cashier's check on the table between us. The amount written on it was exactly what they owed on the house, plus enough extra to cover the late fees and penalties that had accumulated. Mom stared at the check like it was written in a foreign language. Dad picked it up, examined it closely, then looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. "Hadley, I don't understand," Mom said quietly. "How is this possible? You just graduated college." I spent the next hour explaining everything. My job at Riverside Development, the investment opportunity I'd identified, Marcus's partnership offer, and the renovation project I'd managed while working full-time. I showed them the financial projections, the before and after photos of the Lakewood house, and the sale documents that proved this wasn't some elaborate fantasy. "You did all this yourself?" Dad asked, his voice thick with emotion. "I had help from my boss and the contractors, but yes, I managed the project and made the financial decisions." Mom was crying now, not the frustrated tears I'd seen so often in recent months, but tears of relief and something else I was still learning to recognize: pride. "Why didn't you tell us what you were planning?" she asked. I thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because I was afraid you wouldn't believe I could do it, and because I was afraid I might fail." Dad stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the front yard where he'd taught Ethan to throw football and where I'd drawn chalk pictures on the sidewalk. When he turned back to us, his eyes were red. "Hadley, I owe you an apology," he said. "Your mother and we got so focused on Ethan's potential that we forgot to see what was right in front of us. You've been taking care of yourself since you were old enough to work, and now you're taking care of us too. You don't need to apologize," I said, though part of me had been waiting years to hear those words. "Ethan deserved your support. He had a gift that needed nurturing. You had gifts too," Mom said, reaching across the table to take my hand. "We just didn't know how to see them." The next few hours were unlike any we'd ever spent as a family. We talked about my work, my plans for the future, and for the first time, my parents asked detailed questions about my life that had nothing to do with comparing me to Ethan. I learned that they'd always been proud of my academic achievements but hadn't known how to express it. They'd assumed I was naturally self-sufficient and didn't need the same level of support as Ethan, not realizing that their assumption had become a self-fulfilling prophecy. "We were wrong to take your independence for granted," Dad said. "You shouldn't have had to prove your worth by saving our house." "I didn't do this to prove anything," I replied, and I realized as I said it that it was true. I did it because this house matters to me, and you matter to me regardless of everything else. When Ethan called that evening, as he did every Saturday, my parents insisted I tell him what had happened. His reaction was everything I could have hoped for from my big brother. "Are you kidding me right now?" he shouted into the phone, loud enough that I had to hold it away from my ear. "My little sister is out here buying and selling houses like some kind of real estate mogul? That's incredible." His enthusiasm was genuine and infectious, and for the first time in years, I felt like we were truly siblings rather than competitors for our parents' attention. "I'm proud of you, Hadley," he continued, his voice becoming more serious. "I always knew you were smarter than all of us, but this is next level. Mom and Dad are lucky to have you." Over the following months, my relationship with my parents continued to evolve. They began asking for my advice on financial decisions and home improvements. Mom started telling her friends about my real estate success with the same pride she'd previously reserved for Ethan's football achievements. More importantly, they started seeing me as an adult with valuable perspectives, rather than just their daughter who happened to be good at school. My career at Riverside Development flourished as well. Marcus was impressed enough with my first independent project that he offered me a promotion and the opportunity to lead a team developing affordable housing in underserved communities. It was challenging work that combined my business skills with a sense of social purpose that reminded me of Professor Martinez's words about justice. 6 months after I paid off my parents' mortgage, they visited me in Columbus for the first time. I gave them a tour of my apartment, introduced them to my colleagues, and showed them some of the properties I was working on. "I still can't believe this is your life," Mom said as we stood in the lobby of a building I was helping to develop. "When did you become so sophisticated?" "I think I've always been this person," I replied. "You just didn't have the chance to see it before." That evening, as we sat in my living room sharing takeout Chinese food, Dad brought up something that had been on his mind. "Hadley, I want you to know that buying our house back for us was the most generous thing anyone has ever done for our family. But I also want you to know that we would have been proud of you even if you hadn't been able to do that." "I know," I said, and I meant it. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped needing their validation to know my own worth. "Your mother and I have been talking, and we want to start paying you back for the mortgage." I shook my head immediately. "That money was a gift, not a loan." "We know," Mom said. "But we also know that you're building something important with your career, and having extra capital for investments could be valuable. We want to contribute to your success the way we should have been doing all along." Their offer meant more to me than the money itself. It represented a fundamental shift in how they saw me and how they wanted to be part of my life going forward. As I reflect on everything that's happened, I realize that buying my parents' house wasn't really about proving anything or getting revenge for years of being overlooked. It was about choosing love over resentment, about using my success to strengthen family bonds rather than break them. I'm 22 years old, and I own a growing real estate portfolio. I have a career that challenges me every day and colleagues who respect my abilities. I have parents who finally see me for who I am, and a brother who cheers for my success as loudly as I've always cheered for his. Most importantly, I've learned that being overlooked as a child doesn't have to define you as an adult. Sometimes the greatest gift your family can give you is the necessity of becoming independent, even if that wasn't their intention at the time. The house I grew up in still has the same warm yellow walls and afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. But now, when I visit, I'm not the invisible daughter hoping for attention. I'm Hadley, the woman who turned her quiet determination into something extraordinary, and who used that success to save the place where it all began.